I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The impact of the affirmation was so powerful that it tore through the palace in less than a minute. The acknowledged right to the Queen Mother's priceless brooch belonged to Sophie, Music, Duchess of Edinburgh. When Camilla heard the words, Music, she looked across the room in stunned stillness before getting up so quickly that her chair scratched the floor. The Queen left without saying anything, and the door shut behind her like a proclamation of war. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Sophie stood motionless while Charles observed the closed door. Music. Just moments before, the royal collection keeper had read an official ruling attesting to the jewel's ownership under an attested estate document. A formal determination is a documented decision that specifies who may own or use an item, whereas the royal collection is the organization in charge of maintaining historic royal treasures. It prioritized the desires of the past over the status and demands of the present. Refusing to touch the burgundy presentation case, Sophie lowered both hands into her lap. She realized that the sapphire and diamond piece was more than just ornamentation. During private appearances, the Queen Mother wore it as a symbol of her devotion to her family and her perseverance during the war, giving the diamond a purpose. That legacy would be honored if it were accepted. However, the trusty confidant was worried that her connection with Camilla might be irreversibly harmed. Camilla had inquired about the possibility of reconsidering the choice. In response, Charles stated that the certified record was conclusive, indicating that its dates and handwriting had been scrutinized and deemed authentic. She was more hurt by his composure than by his rage. She gave the monarch the impression that he had prioritized the dignity of another woman over her own. While he found it difficult to reconcile his instinct as a husband with his obligation as a monarch, the handwritten inventory note was then read by the keeper. According to the recorded tale, the woman who served the kingdom without pursuing higher status should receive the brooch. Sophie's expression instantly changed. "Then there is nothing more for me to hear," Camilla remarked, taking off her reading glasses and pushing back her chair. She left the unopened case between Charles and the shocked Duchess before he could respond. However, something worse was hidden by the stillness. Charles saw a second sealed paper underneath the inventory as the door closed. Music. It clarified why the Queen Mother had purposefully prohibited any future queen consort, a reigning king's wife, from automatically seizing the diamond. The gathering had been stunned by Camilla's departure, but those unspoken comments were going to turn wounded pride into something much more intimate. To the outside world, Sophie and Camilla had stood on the same balconies, participated in the same rituals, and guarded the same establishment for years. However, they stood for two very distinct routes into royal life behind palace doors. Under constant inspection, one battled for acceptability. Through silent duty, the other gradually gained trust. Now, a single relic had transformed those disparate travels into an inevitable parallel that neither woman had asked for, Music, but both of them understood right away. Through years of quiet service, Sophie solidified her status by stepping up whenever the family required trustworthy working royals. A family member who formally represents the Queen at ceremonies, public appearances, and charitable visits is known as a working royal. She finished challenging assignments without asking for more help. Camilla took a far more difficult route. It took years of public pressure, careful preparation, and Charles's protection for her to change from a contentious outsider to the current king's wife and queen consort. When Sophie was by herself with Edward, she finally spoke up. She acknowledged that the brooch felt more like a burden than a gift as she gazed at the unopened case. The valued confidant was afraid that Camilla would view every subsequent appearance as a challenge if she wore it. After listening intently, Edward reminded his wife that turning down the jewel may also seem like a betrayal of the late Queen's confidence. He could see why she felt caught between tranquility and loyalty. Camilla brought the same anguish into her own sitting room. Music. With a swift motion, she took another brooch off her coat and placed it on a velvet tray. The Queen informed Charles upon his arrival that the decision had rendered decades of sacrifice seemingly insignificant. She had withstood criticism, restored her public standing, and supported him during the most trying times. However, a single scribbled sentence suddenly seemed to imply that the crown had been more diligently served by someone else. Charles responded in private, without the presence of advisors. He disclosed that he had not chosen Sophie and had no power to undo the verified ruling. The king maintained that interfering to protect Camilla would harm them both. She heard his justification, but it didn't reassure her. The crown was safeguarded by restriction, according to the monarch. When his wife most needed him, it seemed like desertion. Then Edward opened a personal account he had saved from years ago, but it was dated. It captured a dialogue in which Elizabeth II complimented Sophie on her assistance to the family without requesting praise. The Duchess realized that the brooch represented a decision made long before the palace meeting because the late Queen had mentioned her loyalty twice. Sophie then looked at the sealed page, which is a confidential document that is kept closed until it is formally reviewed. Windsor, a private luncheon, and a pledge made in front of two women were all mentioned. Sophie was one of the witnesses. Everything was altered by the alternative name. The declaration from the palace had not started the conflict. Camilla thought everyone had forgotten that it had started years ago during a peaceful lunch in Windsor. Clear's throat. The Queen Mother's jewel first surfaced at a tiny Windsor event years before the brooch split the palace. No cameras were there, and no statement was made. Only a few minutes passed throughout that lunch. However, it gave rise to the private pledge that still governs the royal family. Music. Sophie recalled every word. Camilla recalled being left out. Additionally, the late Queen made sure that neither recollection could ever be written off as a miscommunication. Following the Queen Mother's passing, the palace was compelled to keep diamonds set aside for official royal usage apart from her private belongings. While official items were still available for tasks performed on behalf of the crown, private belongings belonged to her family estate. Clear written instructions were included with some diamonds. Others relied on family inventories, which were comprehensive lists that documented the origins, users, and intended destinations of royal artifacts. Due to two contradictory notes in its file, the brooch was kept sealed. A queen consort, or the spouse of a reigning monarch, may use one temporarily. The other suggested that a woman selected for devoted service would acquire permanent ownership. Because wearing the diamond momentarily did not grant you the right to keep it, that conflict was significant. No one could legitimately claim it until the genuine intention was verified. After returning from a rigorous engagement abroad, Sophie recalled receiving a private invitation to Windsor. She was invited to a private lunch by Elizabeth II, who also commended her for taking on tasks that a number of others had denied. The monarch wanted Sophie to know that her self-control had not gone unnoticed because she was aware of how frequently the trusty confidant labored without recognition. The late Queen then requested that a tiny burgundy case be brought forward. Before she spoke, Elizabeth II carefully opened it and touched the brooch. This should eventually fall to someone who recognizes responsibility without possession. Those remarks were not given to Sophie as a gift. She did not make a claim or make a request. However, that same afternoon, a senior dresser noted the precise date, location, witnesses, and phrases uttered by the monarch in a documented household account. Months later, Camilla found out about the lunch. She questioned Charles about why the Queen Mother's jewel had been displayed without her knowledge, but he was unable to offer a response that would have lessened her shame. The king maintained that he was not present at the gathering and was unaware of any such pledge. To her, all she heard was exclusion. While she stayed outside the private circle, Sophie had been invited within. Later, Camilla asked for the brooch to be used in a Commonwealth reception, which brings together delegates from countries connected by the Voluntary Commonwealth Association. Because the late Queen had ordered the case sealed until ownership could be verified, palace custodians declined. That rejection was something she would never forget. Officials had to reopen the record after Camilla tried to release the jewel for a state dinner years later. The Windsor account was verified. The Queen rushed off when Sophie's rights were upheld. She was going to confront Sophie without any courtiers, paperwork, or formalities between them since what she had written off as an old misunderstanding had become enforceable. Camilla stayed inside the palace. She ignored her assistants, went through 2 hallways, and waited for Sophie in a smaller drawing room. They were not accompanied by officials, and their husbands were not there to ease the tension. The Queen did not meet the Duchess when she arrived. With one crushing inquiry, she gestured to the vacant chair across from her. "How long have you been aware that they planned to deliver it to you?" Music, Sophie paused a few steps into the space. Instead of the quiet attempt at reconciliation she had anticipated, Camilla stood by the fireplace with the written affirmation from the previous meeting. A lady who has attained a high royal position via marriage or title is known as a duchess. But now no status could keep her safe. The affirmation had significantly more weight than a verbal familial pledge since it was the palace's official record of its choice. Camilla thought Sophie's attendance at the Windsor luncheon was proof enough. She claimed that the reliable confidant had known for years that the brooch was meant for her. The personnel in charge of safeguarding, documenting, and overseeing royal artifacts, known as palace custodians, had just finished their examination. However, the Queen maintained that Sophie had known the true solution long before they did. Sophie was deliberate in her word choice. She acknowledged recalling the late Queen's words, but she had never regarded them as official commitments. Music, the Duchess had not contacted the custodians, asked for the jewel, or influenced their inquiry. During a private lunch, Elizabeth II had spoken warmly. The brooch had not been given to her. Sophie thought it would have been quite wrong to assert ownership before the written record was verified. At last, Camilla lost her composure. While the palace turned loyalty into a rivalry between them, she accused Sophie of hiding behind silence. Every silent act of service, according to the Queen, is now evaluated in light of her traumatic past. Sophie's face became stern. In response, she said that ignoring the recorded truth would be disrespectful to Elizabeth II, whose last desires should be honored even if they were uncomfortable. Music, Camilla put the confirmation on a table and disclosed in their private talk that she had already chosen the brooch for a state banquet that was coming up. A formal royal luncheon honoring a significant foreign visitor is called a state supper, because she thought the Queen Mother's jewel would demonstrate continuity between the past and present. She had intended to wear it while commemorating Charles's reign. Now, losing it felt like losing credibility in front of the family and the nation. Sophie volunteered to keep the brooch undamaged. Camilla instantly rejected the compromise. Music, the deepest wound was not possession. In her view, the message was that the family had decided which woman stood for dependable service and which woman would always be condemned for her past. Only after their voices could be heard over the closed door did Charles come in. After glancing at Camilla and Sophie, he motioned for them to have a seat. The king's expression was one of tiredness rather than rage. He declared that even he was powerless to overturn the decision. Charles's explanation would show why neither marriage, status, music, nor royal wrath could alter the outcome, even though the clash had revealed the wound. In addition to presiding over ceremonies and appointing high-ranking officials, kings also bear the crown's outward authority. However, Charles was confronted by a force established by the desires of his predecessors in that inner chamber. He could challenge the procedure, postpone making a statement, or console Camilla. However, he was unable to simply remove a valid personal command. For the first time that day, the king appeared more like a husband caught between duty and affection than a ruler. Charles clarified that the crown did not just refer to the individual wearing it, but also to the ongoing power and duties of the monarchy. There were limits to even that authority. Rather than being part of the state regalia, the Queen Mother's brooch was part of her personal collection. Ceremonial diamonds that the country uses for official purposes. A privately held heirloom could not be handled by her family as if it belonged to the person with the greatest position. As her husband explained the official family settlement linked to the Queen Mother's personal property, Camilla listened. The formal agreement governing the disposition of her belongings upon her death was known as the settlement. The notes, ink, paper, handwriting, signatures, and inventory references were compared to uncontested records from the same time period by royal collection custodians. Every test produced the same result. The guidance was sincere. Charles was urged by Camilla to delay the confirmation until after the state supper. She did not call for the abolition of Sophie's rights. She needed time to discreetly swap out the brooch so she wouldn't be rejected in public. The king put his pen on the table slowly. He claimed that any delay would appear to be meddling intended to benefit his wife. Preserving her emotions might undermine the decision's overall integrity. Music. Sophie saw their marital suffering encircling her. Charles stopped her when she tried to go away. The legal recipient was the trusted confidant, and he refused to talk about her future as if she didn't exist. Sophie stayed sad. burdened by the guilt of someone who had done nothing wrong, yet nevertheless worried, causing pain to another lady. The second page was sealed, and Charles opened it. The brooch must never come with the title of queen, according to the written instruction. In Camilla's instance, music denotes the wife next to the reigning king, and that title belongs to a female monarch. The purpose of the jewel was to reward individual consistency, steadfast devotion demonstrated over time rather than marriage, social standing, music, or proximity to the throne. The last notation then had a greater impact. Following the Windsor luncheon, Sophie's name was scribbled by Elizabeth II, indicating that she was the intended receiver. Music, a private declaration of love, was turned into a particular family directive by the late Queen's handwriting. Sophie's gaze dropped. Camilla remained silent. That night, Charles gave the custodians permission to move the treasure. Camilla's indignation vanished into a more uncomfortable calm than rage as she realized the case would actually be leaving royal storage. The legal dispute was resolved. However, the family started to feel the emotional fallout when the brooch changed hands. That night, a burgundy case was sent to Sophie's private quarters from safe royal storage. There was no victorious presentation, no family get-together, and no ceremony. However, everyone knew what its movement meant. The heirloom Camilla was supposed to wear had been lost. Charles was left to witness a private conflict become an enduring part of palace history, while Sophie had acquired an item she feared would isolate her. The sealed case was delivered by 2 custodians along with a transfer record that recognized Sophie's individual rights. A transfer record is an official document that details the conditions that are still in place when a significant item, like music, changes legal custody. Strict security and insurance were still needed for the diamond, and any formal loan or temporary authorization to wear the brooch at a royal function would have to be documented. As the family representative, Edward signed after seeing the transfer. Without touching the case's clasp, he observed his wife placing both hands next to it. Sophie discreetly turned down a custodian's invitation to see the contents. She had not engaged in combat or declared victory. Nevertheless, the trusted confidant believed that everyone in the palace was expecting her to rejoice over the humiliation of another woman. Sophie didn't open the lid until the room was empty. The late Queen's trust and the original ownership by the Queen Mother were represented by the diamond and sapphire brooch. Before she could stop herself from crying, she recalled Elizabeth II complimenting her comm service at Windsor. Although the jewel brought recognition, it also put the family heirloom she had spent years guarding in jeopardy. Camilla encountered a distinct emptiness. She observed the location of the brooch as she stood in front of the state dinner attire. The Queen canceled the fitting after requesting that her dresser remove the complete suit. She couldn't bear to pretend the loss didn't matter and replaced the jewel with another one. That night, Charles wrote a handwritten note to his wife. Music. The king clarified that upholding the monarchy's enduring power and obligation, the crown, occasionally required making a choice that harmed people closest to it. Although he acknowledged that her suffering had hurt him as well, he maintained that altering the result would have compromised the very organization they both worked for. Camilla carefully folded the message after reading it twice and did not respond. Before closing the case, Sophie found something underneath the brooch. A smaller card contained Elizabeth II's last written directive, which stated that the gem should first be worn at a service-oriented event rather than a sovereign one. It was not intended to be a show of strength. It was intended to recognize those who put in effort without expecting recognition. Sophie made the decision not to keep the brooch hidden forever. She would enlist Camilla's assistance in selecting its initial appearance. While his wife thought that quiet would make the damage permanent, Edward was afraid that the gesture might reopen it. The brooch had found its rightful owner, but Sophie realized that possession by itself could never bring harmony back. That could only be accomplished by an open discussion. The next morning, Sophie discovered Camilla, music, in a quiet garden room far from advisors and important documents. She didn't bring a prepared statement or a jewel case. Music. Neither woman talked for a few seconds. The Duchess then took an unexpected action. She expressed regret, not for accepting the brooch, but rather for not realizing how profoundly the choice would revive wounds Camilla had spent years attempting to hide. Without consulting their husbands or palace authorities, Sophie had asked for the meeting. Instead of speaking as members of opposing ranks, she wanted them to speak as members of the same family. The trusty confidant realized that titles would only widen the gap between them, even though the title of Duchess denotes a high royal rank. She needed Camilla to pay attention to the lower-ranking individual. Camilla stayed cautious. As Sophie described the card beneath the diamond, she looked aside. The brooch was first to be worn at an event celebrating service rather than royal power, according to its published instructions. The queen listened without answering, but the anger in her silence had faded. It was heavy with fatigue. During their private talk, Camilla finally broke the stillness. She acknowledged that sapphires or diamonds had never really been the source of her rage. The queen was afraid that the choice had validated something far more agonizing. She might never inherit the family's greatest trust, even though she stood next to the king and joined the highest echelons of the monarchy. She had a place because to music rank. The remembrance of how challenging her arrival had been remained. Sophie gave a calm, strong response. Jewelry could not convey trust, and no brooch could elevate one woman while demeaning another. She reminded Camilla that it took patience, discipline, strength, and music to endure years of animosity. These attributes could not be created or taken away by the Queen Mother's jewel. Then Sophie made a surprising proposal. For the brooch's debut, she invited Camilla to select the charity event, a public event that supports individuals or causes instead of honoring royal status, is called a charity occasion. One requirement was made explicit by the trusted confidant. She was neither relinquishing ownership nor challenging the late Queen's directive. Camilla was invited to assist her in determining the jewel's future significance. Camilla looked at her for a long time. She then suggested holding a reception to commemorate hospice workers, who offer consolation and assistance to patients who are nearing the end of their lives. They served with dignity, perseverance, music, and minimal public recognition. The Queen acknowledged that the Queen Mother, who had valued service rendered without compensation, would have been pleased by such an event. Sophie agreed right away. Their conflict was not resolved by the arrangement. However, its course was altered. At last, pain had led to honesty, and honesty had created space for respect. Before Sophie could get to the door, Milla stopped her. Would it be possible for them to go to the reception together? The dependable confidant looked around and nodded. Soon, their secret ceasefire would come under public scrutiny, and a single photo could either validate peace, music, or reveal every rift they had been unable to mend. The palace announcement had transcended the confines of private letters by midday. The public witnessed more than just a dispute over a diamond. There was a competition over allegiance, remembrance, and who really embodied the late royal matriarch's ideals. However, there was no conflict in the picture that came to define the day. It depicted Camilla standing next to Sophie, near enough for their shoulders to touch, while Sophie wore the brooch. In a succinct public statement, music, the palace affirmed Sophie's rights and clarified that ownership had been proven by verified private documents. An official statement released on behalf of the royal family to provide the public with a clear stance is called a palace statement. There was no space for disagreement. The choice would not be changed, and the trusty confidant had the Queen Mother's jewelry. The distinction between state-owned and private royal jewelry was swiftly clarified by commentators. While state-owned jewels are used for official purposes and are part of the ongoing monarchy, personal jewels may be inherited like family property. Because of this discrepancy, a private dispute concerning inheritance, service, and whether royal position should ever take precedence over a recorded dying request became a national conversation. Music. Sophie thought it would be impolite to show up with the brooch so soon. She was concerned that people would see her first appearance as a triumph against Camilla. The Queen would not back down. During their private talk, she informed the Duchess that if she hid now, rage would become the permanent version of what had happened. They had to confront the public united if they wanted the truth to be remembered. Before they reached the hospice reception, Camilla made that decision a reality. Volunteers who provide comfort and dignity to critically ill patients and their families were honored at the ceremony. She tweaked the edge of Sophie's collar after noticing that the brooch was resting a little awkwardly. The close confidant was taken aback by the tiny gesture. She could not have been more steadied by an apology. Music. A crowd gathered around newspaper booths outside Buckingham Palace with a single, massive headline. Music. the Queen Mother's sign of duty is passed down to Sophie. Another episode of royal rage was anticipated by the public. A few minutes later, the reception photo of the two women standing together took the place of the video of Camilla leaving. Sophie gave a recorded public statement to the volunteers. She turned the diamond from competitiveness to duty by giving honor to generations of women who had served without expecting praise. The disagreement was never brought up by the Duchess. Rather, music. She turned to face Camilla as the crowd cheered, and the Queen nodded silently in response. When they got back to the palace, Camilla talked to Charles. In that private chat, she acknowledged that it had been wrong to storm out, but it had been essential to face the agony behind her reaction, music. Without interjecting, the monarch listened. Then he explained to his wife that while maintaining public harmony was important, private integrity had to come next. Although the public had seen the reunion, Charles was aware that the family had the last say. Even away from the cameras, they still needed to determine what the brooch and everything it revealed would stand for going ahead. The end result remained the same. Sophie kept the jewelry that belonged to the Queen Mother. Camilla never again contested the decision, and the palace record was left intact. However, the ruling went beyond ownership. One woman discovered that humility was necessary in order to receive a symbol of trust. The other found that her position next to the king was unaffected by losing that symbol. For one exceptional day, the diamond had split them apart, and in the end, it had forced them both to face truth's rank, which they had been able to evade. Edward, Sophie, and Camilla were summoned by Charles for one last private discussion. The king affirmed that the transfer was final and that there would be no appeal. The palace record is the permanent written record that preserves an official decision, whereas an appeal is a formal effort to overturn that decision. As the monarch clarified that his wife would keep the brooch, Edward listened. Sophie consented that the jewel would mostly be worn during occasions honoring selflessness, compassion, and the tenacity of the country. Helping others without expecting cash or recognition is known as voluntary service. The goal stated on the card underneath the brooch was something the valued confidant wanted to safeguard. Music. Knowing that she had opted for accountability over ostentation, Edward agreed with her choice. Then, in the private discussion, Camilla admitted that her storming out had turned personal pain into a palace catastrophe. Sophie received a direct apology from the Queen, who acknowledged that her wrath had caused her to view the inheritance as a judgment on her entire life. Sophie took the apologies without acting as though their altercation had been harmless. Though it couldn't take away what had been spoken, forgiveness could start to mend the wound music. Assuring Camilla that she had never seen the inheritance as a battle, Sophie closed the Burgundy case. According to her, the jewel ought to serve as a reminder of the family's obligations. Which woman was more important should never be determined by it. The calm obedience that had initially won the brooch was all the Queen heard in those words, not any triumph. Then, reading from the Queen Mother's recorded order, Charles disclosed the last fact. Her choice had never been intended to turn down a prospective consort, the spouse of an active monarch. The purpose of the note was to guarantee that unseen obligation was acknowledged and to prevent status from overriding character. At last, the king realized that Camilla had not been punished by withholding the jewel. To honor Sophie, it had been kept intact. Camilla never looked for the jewelry again after openly endorsing Sophie's ownership. As a sign of supremacy, the close confidant declined to wear it in return. Music. She exclusively selected events related to bravery, compassion, and service. Music. Camilla won a more subdued win, but Sophie had obtained the legal right. She confronted her insecurities without letting them turn into enduring resentment. Because the past was respected without damaging the present, the monarchy grew more stable. The Queen Mother's brooch was left exactly where it belonged, and its lesson was permanently imprinted on the family entrusted with the crown when the palace door, which had closed in rage, eventually reopened through honesty and music. I appreciate you watching. We'll see you in the next one, so please remember to like and subscribe.